This is Community Forum, a community service of CAN TV. I'm your host, Juan Carlos Hernandez. Rape Victim Advocates aims to help survivors of sexual assault by assuring that they are treated with dignity and compassion. But they also seek greater change in how all society responds. Our guest, Ellen Renfro, is here to talk about their efforts. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
Great. Let's start off by talking about you and your role in the organization.
Sure. So I'm the Northside Prevention Educator at RVA, which means that I'm focused on working at schools in the North Side, but I really work with schools, community organizations, churches, universities all over the city.
Okay.
And what the education department does is lead conversations with young people and older people about how best to end sexual violence, support survivors, and really change our whole society.
Okay. So tell me about how a typical day looks for you. You go out into the field, right? Or do people come in?
Sure. So I'm at schools all over the place, so I'm very familiar with the CTA. But just
buses and trains.
Whatever it takes.
Do you bike it too?
Sometimes bike.
Oh, wow.
But yes, so I'm at schools all over the place. Just this morning I was at a school on the near west side talking to kindergartners about safe touches, not safe touches, who safe grown-ups are, things like that.
Kindergartners? Wow. Tell me, why work with kindergartners to talk about this issue? I'm sure some people are like, well, they're kind of young, they really don't know what's going on, why talk to them? Tell me the reasons why and how a workshop or a class with them looks.
Sure. So it's so important to start this conversation with young people, really from kindergarten on up. One of our best programs that we have is called the Safe Touch program. So it's 4 sessions over 4 weeks, talking with
once a week.
Right. Talking with the young children about really their bodies and introducing the idea of consent. And so what that looks like is we think about feelings and touches and safety. And so with language that's appropriate for the age group, we talk about what's a safe touch. For me, a safe touch is when I get home to see my family and my mom gives me a big hug. What's a not safe touch? A not safe touch for me is when my sisters and I were little and we would fight with each other and pull each other's hair. And so we do that. We talk about the private parts of our bodies, which are the parts underneath our swimsuits. And of course, they all love swimming at that age. So it's very easy for them to connect with that idea and then think about it in relation to their own body. And then we introduce the touching rule, which says no one should be touching you in your private body parts unless it's to keep you clean, like a mom gives a baby a bath, or healthy, like sometimes a doctor or a nurse. But apart from that, once those kids learn that rule, they're going to remember that and carry it with them. And so if someone has been touching them in those private body parts, they suddenly have a language for it to talk about it. We also, during that class, identify safe grown-ups. And so a safe grown-up is someone who's 18 or older, not giving you any unsafe touches, not giving you what we call the uh-oh feeling. So the uh-oh feeling is something that kindergartners can really understand right away too. We say it's when your tummy gets all jumpy or your heart goes really fast and your head starts to hurt. That's your body telling you something's not right. So when we give them that language, they can talk about it and say, I felt the uh-oh feeling about a person or a touch, and we say, so that's when you need to talk to a safe grown-up.
So during these workshops, some children might open up, not necessarily give all the details, but they'll say this happened or something like that happened.
You know, at that age, it's so common for them to identify with something and then want to talk about it right away. So certainly I have had disclosures. Actually, during a school last May, I had a fire alarm go off during our presentation, which was a bit of a surprise. But as the children were lining up, one of the students came over to me and said, someone's been touching me in my private body parts, and I was too scared to tell. So this class, this opportunity that we're there is a chance for the kids to have a safe grown-up be right in front of them.
Right. So, and in the case of that child, what happened after that? You don't have, obviously, something else happened, but what did you tell their teacher, and what happened?
So working with the teacher, I identified the child by name and then spoke with the school counselor and social worker. So maintaining the child's confidentiality, we had her come sit with us and we just colored pictures for a while. And the counselor was exceptional at that school, just really patient without, asking for details at all. Just let the child naturally tell her own story of her experience. And then of course, placed a call to DCFS, as both I and the counselor were mandated reporters. So in that case, actually, I found out a few weeks later that the child was believed and supported by her parents, which is, of course, the best outcome possible, although it does not always happen. But she was protected and believed by her mother, and her mother was able to put a stop to the situation and support her child.
Wow. So it's talking about young children like that. If my understanding is correct, teachers are obligated, if they suspect, even if they suspect something happening or something's going on as far as sexual abuse, they're supposed to report it, correct?
That's right.
What law protects teachers, or why is that mandated? Do you know a little bit about that?
I would say that's not my area of focus really, but
Okay.
I do know that it's in the child's best interest to have this
Okay.
abuse be identified and then stopped. So having these conversations and having RVA as a guest in the schools is really just an opportunity for the kids to learn more about their own bodies and start thinking about the grand idea overall, which is you have to ask permission before you touch or tickle any other person.
Right.
And people need to be asking you, and you get to decide about your own body. And so
Right.
those kinds of ideas are really the most important parts of the program.
Okay.
And then, of course, if a child discloses, we work with the teachers to make sure that they're supported.
So when you are giving these classes for children, you're also empowering the teachers.
Of course, yes. And teacher trainings are another part of what we do, making sure that the teachers feel comfortable talking to their students about sexual violence and abuse, and also that they would feel comfortable if a child came to them to know what to do.
So how does the teacher training work out? Do you carry that out as well?
Well, of course, teachers have very limited free time. They're very busy people, but yes, so we'll work with the school to set up a meeting with the teachers, even if it's just for half an hour.
Half an hour.
Just to talk to them about how, we at RVA say there's 3 things that we hope that every survivor hears, every victim of sexual violence. I believe you, this is not your fault, and you have options.
Could you say that again, please?
Oh, sure.
Because those are so important, and our viewers and children, adults, teachers should all know that.
Sure, so it's I believe you, this is not your fault, and you have options. We hope that every victim of sexual violence hears that from at least one person in their lives.
Okay, so first, I believe you. Why is that so crucial?
Well, we live in a culture where victims are routinely dismissed or made fun of or questioned about their experiences, right? I mean, this is we see it everywhere. Victims are asked, well, what were you wearing? Or why were you out so late? Or why did you
Right.
go home with that person? Or why were you drinking so much, right? We doubt their experiences. And so for a victim to hear from even one person, I believe you, it can be so powerful.
Okay, and the second one is,
This is not your fault.
this is not your fault. Now, yes, it's not a person's fault,
Right.
but a lot of times people who are victimized do feel that it is their fault, or they
Right.
might feel that. Why is that crucial?
That's another part that our culture says, this is
Like you just mentioned, you
Right.
address a certain way.
right. Or why didn't you fight back? Or
Okay.
why didn't you run away or get help? Right. So our culture asks a lot of questions of victims when we should be asking those of the perpetrator, right? So the responsibility for sexual violence lies solely on the shoulders of the person who chose to commit the crime. And so it is never the victim's fault, no matter what.
No matter what the
No
circumstances.
matter what. It's never their fault.
Okay, so I believe you, it's not your fault. And finally again,
You have options.
okay, well, tell us about some of those options for
Sure.
for children, and then we're going to move on to an age group, because I
Sure.
do certainly want to talk about how you work with most age groups. You don't work with anybody past college age, right?
Oh, no, we work with the general community too.
General
so
community.
adults
Okay,
and
we'll certainly talk about that as well
Sure.
too. But let's talk about that last one.
you have options, right? So I'm a big sister, and sometimes I have this motivation where I just want to take care of things or take charge, and but after someone has been raped or assaulted, their choices were taken away from them. And so what you want to do if someone has just told you that they were a victim, you want to give those choices back. You do not want to take charge and say, I'm going to make some phone calls, I'm going to get you the help that you need. You want to give them the options and let them know, we could call for help, we could talk to an organization like RVA, we could get counseling for you, we could go to the hospital, but you want to give the choices back to the victim and let them make the choice that's right for them.
Okay, great. So now let's move on in age groups.
Sure.
Certainly, these are important. This is important for information to have. But How do you work with older children and middle school kids, not middle-aged kids?
Middle-aged kids, sure. So with the middle school students, we talk a little bit more about what's flirting, what's harassment, what's the difference, which is usually a conversation that really needs to be had because they have no idea what's appropriate and what's not. We also talk a lot about technology. So what's okay for Facebook? What's okay on Twitter? What's harassment? Where do you draw the line? And what can you do if someone's bothering you about those things? We still use the same language about safe grown-ups because for those kids too, it's really important for them to be identifying people in their lives who they can trust, who they could really talk to about it. And in that case, it may not always be the parents, but of course we encourage the kids when they say that, I would talk to my mom about that. I always want to honor that. I say, that's awesome that you would feel comfortable talking to your parents. Who else do you guys have, just in case you don't? And then we think too about the school counselor, your school teachers, your teachers from the last few years, right? You can always go back and talk to them. But yeah, with the middle school kids, we talk a lot about flirting, sexual harassment, what's a healthy relationship and what's unhealthy, and then how to help a friend too. They're always really interested in well, one of my friends was experiencing this, so we want to say, well, how could you be a good friend to them if they're in an unhealthy situation? What could you do?
So for our young viewers, tell us very briefly, I know it's a half-hour show, but what a healthy relationship looks like and what an unhealthy relationship looks like. Because I think a lot of habits or ideas of what a relationship is and should be can be confusing or not that well known at that age.
Right, and it's so hard to find a good example of a healthy relationship in our popular culture.
Right, that's so true.
Yeah, who do we have except for Jay and Beyonce and Barack and Michelle? But really, it's hard for young kids to have a role model.
Right, and those people are so far away.
They really are, and we don't actually know them.
Right.
But the fundamentals of a healthy relationship, which I love talking about with young people because it applies to friendships too.
Right.
What's most important is communication. Being able to talk to your partner about what's going on, your feelings, what you need from each other. And especially once you start getting involved with sexual activities, you need to have a foundation of healthy communication. Healthy communication, respect, trust. The middle schoolers always want to talk about jealousy and cheating, which is important to, to talk about that too. So.
Okay, so that communication is key.
Right.
But also for those young kids, middle school kids, maybe having an adult they could talk to about.
Of course.
Those issues, right?
Right.
That is so crucial. Now, moving on to high school age, how does the conversation change there?
It's pretty similar still, although of course just at a little more advanced level. But we talk a lot about relationships and what's a normal thing for a partner to expect of you? Is it normal for a partner to be calling you every night, asking you where you've been and asking who you've been with? We want to put up a red flag right there and say that's really not okay. It's not normal for a partner to ask you to be changing your interests or restrict who you're spending time with. We want to put up another red flag for that. So a lot more about healthy relationships and unhealthy relationships, but at a little more advanced level.
Right, and talking about high school kids, you make me think of the book Speak.
Oh, sure.
Have you read that book?
Oh, many years ago, but yes.
It was even made into a movie, but it deals with a girl who was raped. What happens to teenagers when maybe they are on a date or and something like that happens? How can friends and family respond to that? You already mentioned some keys for that, but it could be such a difficult and sensitive time for a person. What do you recommend?
For the friends and family?
Friends and family to respond if somebody happens to tell them, and how should they respond to be sensitive and letting them know that they're there, but without invading their privacy even more.
Right, and their own healing process.
Right, exactly.
I would say, the three things we said earlier: I believe you. This is not your fault, and you have options. But also letting that person have space to heal in whichever way they choose. Because of course, every person who has been a victim of sexual violence will respond in a different way. And we as a culture have an expectation that someone will be hysterically crying, that they'll have physical bruises. But of course, that's a very small percentage of what actually happens. That some people will just emotionally kind of shut down. Some people will try to respond with humor to make light of the situation because they feel nervous or every person is going to have such an individual reaction. So really for friends and family of a young person who has been assaulted, allow them space and still let them know that you're there to be a support when they need you, if they need you.
Definitely. Now, and that leads me to another question. What does a rapist look like?
Oh.
Because
Well,
we have these myths
of course,
of the stranger looking in the corner. Not that doesn't happen. It
Right.
obviously does.
right.
But during our conversation before the show, you mentioned that that's not necessarily true. So tell me about that.
Yeah, so when we work with high schoolers and even middle schoolers sometimes, I like to ask, so what have you heard about rape or rapists? What ideas are shown to us on television, on TV shows, movies, on the news even? What gets reported about? And of course, many times what gets reported is a stranger in a dark alley. And so we come to believe that that's what rape looks like, when of course it is, that is not the only way that sexual violence happens. It's really much more common for a rapist to be someone that the victim already knows and trusts, which of course would probably make it even harder for them to come forward and talk about. And so, a big part of my job is breaking down the myths around sexual violence, and stranger rape being the most common or only form of violence is a big myth.
Right. And so how can teenagers, you're certainly talking about healthy relationships, how else can we help prevent sexual violence from taking place in that age group?
So encouraging young people to feel open talking about sex is gonna go so far. Helping young people consider consent. What does it mean to give consent? How does
what
that
does
look?
that mean?
Right.
What does that look like? Okay, tell us.
Sure, I can give you all the answers. No, I can't. But starting conversations with young people and letting them know that it's healthy to talk to your partners about sex, to say what you like and what you don't like, to feel confident doing that. So encouraging young people to make that a part of a healthy relationship.
Okay, and also at that age where there's a lot of experimentation with drugs and alcohol, what do you tell young people about the consequences of dealing with or consuming that?
Well, one of the activities that I really like doing with middle schoolers and high schoolers is called the timeline activity. And so I draw a line up on the board from like age 5 to 30 or with a lot of different Post-its, including like your first kiss, your first date, your first boyfriend or girlfriend, your first time having sex, first time getting married or getting married, having a baby.
Right.
And what we do as a class is we ask 2 questions. So at what age do you think someone would be ready for this? Emotionally, financially, physically, and we put the Post-its up in a different, and we talk about it as a class. And then the next time we do it, we ask, so at what age do you think this actually happens? And of course, there are no right answers. There's no one timeline that's gonna work.
Right.
And I also wanna honor too that not everyone gets to pick their own timeline, right? Sometimes people who have been sexually assaulted, they don't get to pick where that Post-it went.
Right.
And so for the young people, it's really starting the conversation for them to think about, what do you want your own timeline to look like? Because of course, some of it you will get to choose. And so we really emphasize, there's a lot of things to be thinking about before you make any of these choices in a healthy relationship. And, of course, it doesn't make sense to make fun of anyone else's timeline, whether they're ahead or behind you, because that contributes to an unhealthy atmosphere, right?
Right. Yeah, people may get involved in a relationship because they feel pressure from their peers or they're at a certain age and they think they should have experienced something by that time, right?
Right. So we want to break down that idea and let the young people know, your experience is what's right for you.
Okay, and now moving on to a huge age group, and it's the college age. They're all big, but one where there is, I think at least my perception is that the experimentation or changes that have taken place during high school and middle school are now we're working with adults, we're dealing with adults, but yet they're adults who are very young and still seeking to find their way and to experiment. How do you talk about this issue and what's commonly called date rape? Because that tends to happen a lot in the college age. At least that's my understanding of it.
So when we're speaking with college students, you're right, it's so different from high school because they have this amazing level of independence that they've never had before, which makes them really excited to try new things and have new experiences, which can be a great thing. We want to continue the conversation about consent, have them know that consent is required before any sexual activity. And just because you've done it with one person before doesn't mean that you just have to keep doing it with them. Or,
Right.
we want them to know that you have the power to give or take away consent at any time for any activity.
And saying, yes, I want to have sex with you, or no, I don't,
Right.
essentially.
Right.
It's just plain and simple like that.
Right. So we want them to feel empowered to have conversations about what they like and what they don't like and what they don't want to do. And we want to remind them that it's necessary to respect another person's decisions about consent.
So, so you also go to colleges and universities to talk?
Yes, yeah, sometimes.
Yeah, tell me about how one of those workshops or a talk has happened, and give me an example of that and how students have responded.
Sure. So I think, as a general rule, students are excited to see us when we come do workshops because this is not a conversation that they get to have frequently. And especially with the younger ones, they finally have a chance to ask questions about things they're curious about.
Right.
But in colleges, I always really enjoy college presentations because you have a chance to talk about this stuff at a more advanced level. And the students are sometimes more willing to share their own experiences, and it just is a much richer conversation.
Okay.
So,
Now, I'm also curious, we're in a global city, multilingual city. Do organizations come to you and say, could you give this workshop to us in another language? And what languages do you offer these workshops in?
Sure. So we can offer the workshops in English or Spanish.
Okay. Just English and Spanish.
Right. The educational workshops in English or Spanish. In our
Okay.
counseling department, actually,
Okay.
we can offer counseling services in English or Spanish or Japanese.
Or Japanese. Wow. That's
Good to
interesting.
know.
Yeah, that's certainly good to know. Now, you obviously do great work, and you don't do it alone. So
No.
who do you collaborate with throughout the city to carry this out, this important work out?
Well, we are a proud member of an organization called Communities in Schools of Chicago, which brings together different organizations who want to work with CPS. And so they are a key partner for us. But there are other rape crisis centers around the city too, and it's important to acknowledge their work because they do similar educational programming. And so together, the three of us can really make the best difference. So.
Okay. And you also, now, let's say somebody, and I know this is not necessarily your area of expertise within the organization, but there is a call by a rape victim. What happens? Just take me through that process as briefly as you can.
Sure. So I think now would be a great time to talk about what RVA does in more general. So RVA has been around for 40 years. This is our 40th year.
Okay.
And we were started by an obstetrician at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, Dr. Natalie Stevens, who saw how victims were arriving at the emergency room and leaving even more traumatized than they had been, when they arrived. And so she and a network of students, medical students and otherwise who were interested in this cause came together to start the advocacy program.
Awesome.
And so that's a program that continues to this day, 24 hours, any day or night of the year, RVA's on call. And so anytime there's a survivor at one of our 14 partner hospitals, we will go and sit with them in the emergency room, make sure that they feel supported, cared for, make sure that they're getting the medical and legal care that they need, and just helping them feel supported, really.
So somebody from the organization or a volunteer will get called.
Right. And RVA could not do half the work that we do today without our volunteers. Our volunteers are exceptional.
Wow. Wow. That's amazing. One final question for you. I guess it's a little personal, but without going too deep. What brought you into this type of work? I'm just curious.
Sure. So ending sexual violence is something that's important to me, both personally and professionally in my job. This is a crime that too often is not talked about. And I had a woman yesterday tell me that she felt so safe in our office that she almost felt like she was on the moon, that she had never felt before.
She was so far away from her problems.
Right, and she was finally in a place where she could speak openly and safely about what happened to her, and she felt that had never felt that before, so she felt like she was on another planet. And that stuck with me because it is a crime that, too often people feel like they have to hide or that they can't talk about. And so working to end that stigma and support survivors is something that is really important to me.
Great. Well, thank you so much for coming out today and for
Thank you.
sharing a lot of what you're doing out in the community for victims and supporting them.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Okay. Community Forum is a community service of CAN TV. If your nonprofit organization would like to work with CAN TV, call 738-1400 and ask for nonprofit services. Tune into Community Forum for local issues and concerns every Saturday at 7:30 p.m. on CAN TV 21. I'm Juan Carlos Hernandez. Thank you for joining us.